a 3-time Nobel Literature Prize nominee, an actor, a master of kendo, a homosexual, a trained fighter pilot, a bodybuilder, the leader of a private army, a film director, and a nationalist who killed himself after trying to speak to the Japanese military, but failed to compel them. Known by his pen name, Japanese writer Yukio Mishima was once Japan's #1 novelist. But he was much more than that. Born in Tokyo in 1925 as Kimitake Hiraoka, Mishima's childhood was filled with troubling times. His father was a government official, his mother the daughter of a school principal. His first 12 years were dominated by his grandma Natsuko, who had essentially kidnapped Mishima from his parents for several years. Here he spent most of his days indoors, almost never seeing sunlight, taking care of his bedridden grandmother and taking consolation in her books. His grandmother Natsuko was the granddaughter of a powerful feudal lord and grew up in the household of Prince Arisugawa Taruhito. This made Mishima a direct descendant of Tokugawa Ieyasu, the founder and first shogun of the Tokugawa shogunate of Japan, which ruled Japan from the 1600s until 1868. Mishima's mother was the daughter of Kenzo Hashi, a scholar of Chinese classics and part of a family that had served the samurai clan Maeda for centuries. Mishima was very proud of his samurai ancestry, and he grew up in a house of traditionality, pride, and a house dominated by women. Mishima first started writing around 12 years old, after he had returned to his parents. His father would disapprove of this behavior, tearing up his manuscripts, calling his interests effeminate and beneath his status. This was a regular theme in his early childhood. His years with his grandma had made him more feminine than others his age, and his times indoors had impacted him so much that he was white, frail, and at the age of 12 looked more like 8 or 9. And he would be to have a lot of trouble with his body and the side of him that he feared was effeminate. It would eventually lead to self-loathing. At a young age, Mishima was already incredibly talented with a pen in his hand. Teachers were impressed and helped Mishima find his pen name, to hide the fact that he was writing from his classmates and father. When he did eventually trust the other students enough to come clean about him being a part of the literary society, it saw him bullied and traumatized. His love for writing would take him as far as he got, but at times also held him back. Despite his father's heavy disapproval, Mishima would keep writing in secret every single day, his mother being his biggest supporter, helping him cover it up. Throughout his years as a teen, Mishima would keep writing. Yet a direct career as a novelist wasn't in the stars right away. After graduating the University of Tokyo in 1947, he got an impressive position as a government official in the Ministry of Finance. But after just a year, Mishima chose to focus on writing instead. Mishima's 1949 novel, Confessions of a Mask, a believed to be semi-autobiographical novel about a young homosexual who must hide behind a mask to fit into society, was his real breakthrough. His positive portrayal of homosexual characters was quite scandalous at the time. At the young age of just 24, Mishima had become a celebrity, first in Japan, then across the world. Mishima was known in his books for fictionalizing real events such as the burning of the Golden Pavilion, a famous temple in Kyoto, and Arida's campaign to become governor of Tokyo, for which Mishima was sued for invasion of privacy. His books read like poetry, and themes like patriotism, the decay of age, the beauty of the human form, and sexual frustration were extremely prevalent in his books. Mishima was nominated for the Nobel Prize of Literature 3 times, often being the favorite to win, but never did. Mishima was not just a novelist, he was also a playwright, an actor, a director, and a model. He acted in several movies, like the 1960s film Afraid to Die, the 1966 film Yokuko, directed by himself, and 68's Black Lizard. His modeling career ranged from works like Otoko, photo studies of a young Japanese male, Barakai, Ordeal by Roses, and Young Samurai, bodybuilders of Japan. And bodybuilding highlights one of Mishima's strongest beliefs. Mishima's femininity was one point of self-hatred for him, but his body, at that time still frail, short at 155 centimeters and unattractive, was a second theme of self-loathing. He deemed his greatest weakness to be his body. He started bodybuilding. In 1955, Mishima took on 3 sessions a week of weight training, which he didn't disrupt once in those last 15 years of his life. His preparation for death began then, with the preparation of his body. A death by suicide would lack honor if the body is old and unsightly. If he were to make a poem of his life, he needed a beautiful body. Mishima often said he deplored the notion many intellectuals had, that one's mind is more important than the body. He believed both mind and body to work together and strengthened each other. He became a master of kendo, the Japanese art of swordsmanship. Once he had started to become stronger, he became proud of his body. He showed it off to everyone and everybody, as if he had just bought a new watch. Mishima's alleged homosexuality similarly defined him. As mentioned before, his first popular book, Confessions of a Mask, detailed the story of a gay protagonist. It's assumed that this is autobiographical. Mishima often visited gay bars for his work on forbidden colors, but also visited many when abroad. He had half-naked pictures taken of himself in leather, and these often made it to gay magazines. Yet he never brought up the subject of his sexuality after the first book, and said that the Confessions of a Mask was purely from the perspective of an onlooker, not a participator. Another writer, Jiro Fukushima, later published an account of his and Mishima's relationship, including several love letters between the two. Mishima's wife denied his sexual orientation being anything other than straight, but it's assumed he was at the very least bisexual, causing a conflict in his mind because of his sexual orientation in a time where this was absolutely taboo. Mishima did however get married. At first he even dated the future Empress of Japan, Michiko Shoda, but eventually had a marriage arranged for him by his parents, which was quite usual at the time. He had only 2 conditions for the woman who would be to marry him. She to have no interest in his work, and she had to be shorter than him. It's unclear how Mishima felt about his wife, but they did produce 2 children. Where often it's easy to separate the person and the politics, this is not the case for Mishima. Even after becoming the most acclaimed novelist of Japan, he still wanted to be someone else. In 1960, his views of politics became more radical. Japan had just signed a treaty with its former enemy, the United States, which would see American bases in Japan, and he was far from happy about that. He believed Japan should keep its identity, and that America had no place in Japan. Many at that point still agreed with him, and there were demonstrations in the streets for years. The protests were going on throughout the 60s, but expected to reach another high in 1970, when the treaty would be due for renewal. At the same time, Mishima was very vocal about wanting Japan to have a real military again. Japan's military after World War II was purely for defense only, and wasn't allowed to have an offensive military. In 1967, Mishima used his connections as a celebrity and joined the Japan Self-Defense Force, the JSDF, which closely resembled the army, but meant only for protecting Japan. He underwent basic training for a year, even going as far as getting trained as a fighter pilot, flying a Lockheed F-104 Starfighter. The days of the samurai were clearly over, but he wanted to keep the code alive. This is when Mishima started his own private army, 80 strong, the Tatenokai, also known as the Shield Society. A private militia composed of mostly young students who studied martial principles and swore to protect the Emperor of Japan, opposing communism, maintaining the national spirit, and defending the Emperor was their main goal. Mishima trained them himself, and he trusted them. One of these student soldiers was Masakatsu Morita, who would write Mishima after a particularly tough training session. "I am ready at any time to lay my life aside, if only for your sake, sensei." That same year, Mishima and his 10 closest disciples would make an oath to protect the emperor. A razor was passed. They cut open their fingers and wrote their names in their own blood. Then they each drank from a cup of their joint blood to seal the deal. Over the top, fantastical, outdated and poetic, like Mishima. Mishima's ideology was to always protect the idea of the emperor as he had known it. This didn't always line up with the actual current emperor of Japan. At one point he denounced the Emperor Hirohito for renouncing his claim of divinity. Mishima believed that so many Japanese soldiers had died in World War II for their living god, and that denouncing that idea meant they had died in vain. In the last 10 years of his life, he kept writing, directing and acting. He wrote the coveted tetralogy The Sea of Fertility, still very popular today. He was, however, also very politically active and very nationalistic in his later life. This would negatively affect him, in Japan especially. He was hated by those leaning left for his commitment to the code of the samurai, Bushido, something they deemed outdated and not fitting of the growing and improving Japan. His need for an offensive military was equally old-fashioned and insensitive to the countries Japan had invaded in the past. In turn, mainstream nationalists were not able to forgive him either for his comments on Emperor Hirohito, leaving only the extreme right to support Mishima. In 1968, his former mentor Yasunari Kawabata won the Nobel Prize of Literature, instead of the also nominated Mishima. The Nobel Prize of Literature was important to Mishima. He'd always wanted to be recognized by the West, something that contradicted some of his political views. He was happy for Kawabata, but some say this day cemented Mishima's view that he wanted to die in early death, as it was unlikely another Japanese writer would win the prize anywhere soon. The riots that Mishima and many others expected to happen in 1970 because of the renewal of the American Treaty never happened, and this disappointed Mishima. He approached his 4 most trusted Shield Society members and asked each of them whether they would be ready to lay their life on the line for the emperor. These 4 would be the earlier mentioned Masakatsu Morita, Ogawa Masahiro, Koga Masayoshi, and a skilled kendo swordsman named Koga Hiroyasu. On November 25th, 1970, Mishima and the 4 members of his Shield Society visited the commandant of the Ishigaya camp, the Tokyo headquarters of the Japan Self-Defense Forces. Here they barricaded the office and tied the commandant to his chair. They were quickly found out and military police was on scene, but Mishima held them back with his sword, wounding 8, begging them to read the demands and retreat. One soldier, Lieutenant Colonel Nakamura, was the only one of the military more than slightly injured. He had tried to grab Mishima's sword, as he believed it to be a replica, and this would cause him to lose some grip strength in his hand throughout his life. Nakamura bore him no ill will though, saying that if he wanted to heavily injure him, he would have done so differently. Mishima's demands were simple: to have the garrison of soldiers gather below and to have Mishima say his part. He wanted to be heard, and he wanted to inspire a coup d'etat to restore the power of the emperor. If the soldiers were to be non-responsive, he would commit seppuku, a ritual Japanese suicide. If they were not to gather the garrison, the commandant would die. His wishes were fulfilled, and the soldiers were gathered below. Mishima stepped onto the balcony and spoke to the soldiers. He voiced disappointment in the current state of the military. He believed the current constitution was unfair, making the soldiers a mere subsection of the American military. It was of no use. Instead of inspiring the soldiers, they jeered him away, calling him a fool. He once again asked, "Is there no one amongst you who will rise up with me?" Now almost desperate. Most soldiers likely never even heard the speech. His words drowned out by the unrest of the other soldiers, police sirens, and the press helicopters above. He was once again jeered away. Mishima had no knowledge of this, but the soldiers below were not the warriors he had hoped them to be. Earlier that day, 900 of the elite soldiers had just left the base for training, leaving only those in charge of media, supplies, and materials to hear his pleas. Mishima finished his speech, spoke glory to the emperor, went back inside, and delivered on his promise. He performed seppuku, stabbing oneself into the belly and disemboweling himself. Morita was supposed to finish the ritual by beheading him. Instead, he failed multiple times, not being able to cut through his neck. Koga Hiroyasu then took over, beheading Mishima. Morita then performed the same act. and he too committed suicide. The day before Mishima's death, he had officially finished his last novel, The Decay of the Angel. In its pages, art prophesied life. Just before the pinnacle, when time must be cut short, is the pinnacle of physical beauty. Clear, bright beauty. In that moment, the beauty of a man and the beauty of a gazelle are in a wonderful correspondence. Raising its horns proudly, raising the hoofs of the white spotted leg ever so slightly in the face of the Nile. Mishima had been planning the suicide for at least a year, and only his 4 closest Shield Society members had known about it. It's assumed that Mishima knew he was going to have to kill himself on that day, and that the coup d'etat was never going to happen. Despite his beliefs, he was likely at peace with that. Mishima had long dreamed of the ritual suicide, and strongly hinted at it in multiple books, short films and plays. He romanticized death by suicide. In his short film, Patriotism, he highlights the act of Seppuku, playing the lead himself, only 2 years before imitating the act in real life. He once said he didn't want to accept the decay of his body, and always hinted at wanting to die young and beautiful. Perfect purity is possible if you turn your life into a line of poetry, written with a splash of blood. Yukio Mishima in Runaway Horses. He left enough money for the legal defense of the 3 remaining Shield members, and had left death poems, a common occurrence for samurai who committed seppuku. Human life is limited, but I would like to live forever, he had said. Many tried to diminish Mishima's life to just 2 words, a failed fascist. Mishima, however narcissistic he might have been, knew he could not change Japan. Many therefore debate he wanted to leave his mark on Japan, both politically and aesthetically, with what he believed to be a beautiful death. The point of his actions can never be completely clear. Was he doing this as a work of art, purely a political action? Yukio Mishima was a tortured soul. The trauma from his youth, his upbringing through the Second World War, and his evident struggles with his sexuality might have made him more radical than was good for him. He, however, thought what he stood for was right. Mishima's legacy is vast. He wrote 34 novels, 50 plays, 25 books of short stories, and at least 35 books of essays. Yukio Mishima died that day, November 25th, 1970, at the age of just 45. We live in an age in which there is no heroic death. Yukio Mishima. As a disclaimer, I'd like to add my own thoughts to this piece. Mishima was by no means perfect. Some of his beliefs were extremely right-wing, outdated, and simply not attainable in post-World War II Japan. Mishima romanticized war and death, and that alone makes his beliefs not line up with mine. His view of women was equally outdated. The point of this video is thus not to show that he was right or wrong. It's just to showcase his fascinating life. He was a unique individual, and there are lessons to be learned from what he stood for. Mishima has also become somewhat of an icon for alt-right movements in the West, who idolize him for all the wrong things. That's why I doubted making this video in the first place. I, however, believe his life was as extraordinary as his death, and worth exploring further. Perhaps this is exactly what Mishima wanted, to be remembered and to live forever. For more on Mishima, I highly recommend the 1985 classic Mishima Alive in 4 Chapters, one of the best biopics I've ever seen. It was never published fully in Japan, mostly because Mishima was hinted at being homosexual. It is, however, an incredible film, especially if you're into art house films in general. I'd highly recommend checking out his vast library of books. Spring Snow is an absolute classic and the start of his tetralogy, so it's absolutely worth a read. The Temple of the Golden Pavilion is seen as his best, equally worth a read. And his books Sun and Steel and Confessions of a Mask in turn are great to read if you want to know more about the man himself, from himself. I hope you enjoyed this video and maybe learned something. If you'd like to see more videos like these, perhaps on Yukio Mishima or his books, do subscribe and tell me, so I know you want more. And please tell me in the comments if you want to see other things.